So, hello everyone. I'm afraid I can't see you from where I'm sat, but it's great to know that you're out there. And thank you ever so much for coming along to our very first Nature Calling conversations. I'll just do a quick introduction to myself and then I'll very, very quickly get into our speakers because this is what we're here all about. But my name's Quentin McLarlin. I work with the National Landscape Association and I'm the Arts Development and Programme Manager for Nature Calling. Very briefly, Nature Calling is a major programme of new art commissionings happening across England from as of May this year up until October this year. And we're working with 6 national landscapes, working with 6 major new commissions, of which we are speaking today with Rob St. John, who was our commissioned artist for the Forest of Bowland. Nature Calling is, as I mentioned before, a major program of work of new commissions, working with our national landscapes, working with our national landscapes teams, local communities, and their commissioned artists. It's been funded through Arts Council England and DEFRA, and we're also working in partnership with Activate Arts, who are based down in Dorset. So Rob St. John, like I mentioned, is our artist that's commissioned for the Forest of Bowland. And the purpose of these In Conversations events was inviting us to profile our artists, but also to ask our artists to invite someone they'd like to have a conversation with. And that could be around their particular practice, but also the kind of the way of working with interdisciplinary practitioners in other sectors and other in other disciplines. So I'm really pleased that Rob has invited Ruth Allen, who is a long-time friend and collaborator. Ruth was a geologist and is now a therapist. And without me sort of blundering into what your practice is, it'd be really great to hear a bit more about that in a minute. Just to say, towards the end of our session, we will be inviting people to ask questions. And if you wouldn't mind using the Q&A function within there, you can put your question in there, and then we'll get around them as quickly as possible. So really, to begin then, Ruth and Rob, I'd like maybe for you to introduce yourselves, but what I'm very interested in is how your friendship really came about, and how do you feel you bring your 2 disciplines together? Starting with Rob.
So Ruth and I have been working together for a few years now. I think one of the big kind of shared common grounds that we have is kind of over the role of listening, and especially group listening, not only to each other but to the world around us, and what that can do to us as people, what it can do in terms of our environmental experience, our ethic, our politics. And so we've been exploring that in a variety of projects. You can see behind Ruth the little human stone of people that was in a film we made for Kendal Mountain Festival in the autumn called Everything Happens for a Season. But yeah, I think I don't want to speak for Ruth, but certainly from my experience, it's a kind of definite ongoing process of learning. You know, kind of we end up sending quite a lot of wind-infused voice notes from the top of moors, being like, Ruth, the rock's not quite sounding as I thought it was going to sound, and kind of putting weird and wonderful microphones into limestone pavements. But, you know, over the years of talking back and forth between, you know, listening to the world and listening to people, listening to each other, we've kind of formed this sense of collaboration.
Yeah, I second that. I second that. Yeah, I think we're both really interested in different scales around listening, different, and perhaps something will come on to different levels of intimacies in listening, from that very intimate space through to that sort of political listening. So yeah, I think, you know, we're in that same sort of circle of interest, and as you say, we send each other voice notes and just run things we've read that are interesting, because we intersect, and obviously we also share a sort of an interest in landscape and being in the land, and being on the land, and some kind of affinity between us to the Trough of Bowland and the northern landscapes. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's probably a similar sense of journey, for want of a better term, there as well, isn't there? Of you starting off as a geologist and now being, not only a kind of ecotherapist, but also a writer and an artist in your own, regard. And for me, just being an outdoors lad, growing up in Bowland side of Pendle Hill and thinking, right, what's the best way I get to spend as much time outdoors as I possibly can? And for me, that was thinking, right, I'll do a geography degree. And then through, wayward behaviour and playing in bands and doing exhibitions and stuff, somehow 20 years later, I've ended up being an artist. But we've both kind of, yeah, we've both had that same sense of percolation into what we do. It's creativity in different forms.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've got a lot of questions.
That's great. I was just wondering whether within your sort of disciplines and obviously a kind of close friendship, Rob, within your project, Are You Lost, which is our commission project for Nature Calling, you've been able to really draw on lots of themes around a sense of place and belonging, and we'll probably go into it a bit more around sort of young people as well about their sense of place. And I just wondered, Ruth, really within your own practice and obviously connecting a therapeutic approach to landscape, how you think people connect through landscape, whether it's whether that sense of place is part of it, or is that nurture, is that sort of nature nurture or something, those kind of ideas.
Yeah, I think that's something that we will definitely come to, and I think because I think we're both concerned with what is the role of place, and this Rob's project with National Landscapes it's really in there. For me, perhaps there is a sense that it can be more diffuse, particularly in a therapeutic realm. I work for sort of political reasons outside, for philosophical reasons. There's a whole sort of theory of mind and place and eco-psychology there around why I'm outside. But of course, there is something ambiguous about that as well. So I think there's interesting the way that that can come into the therapeutic space. And I hope that it does. And that comes in different ways on that very local scale compared to perhaps that deliberate intention at the community level that Rob's project, I think, is designed to sort of get into.
And Rob, could you speak a little bit more then how you've been addressing that sense of place and belonging within Are You Lost and maybe your wider practice?
Yeah, so um, Are You Lost has been a real amazing opportunity for me to work deeply and over a long period of time in a place that I know and love, kind of grew up in, but particularly with communities around what we might call the fringes of the Forest of Bowland. Bowland, for people who don't know, is an area of upland moor and peatland in the northwest of England, to the north of Manchester, south of the Lake District. And historically, it's been quite an exclusion, or not even quite, a very exclusionary landscape. It's been privately owned, lots of private keep out signs, not a welcoming place in so many ways. And the Countryside Rights of Way Act came in 2004, which opened up lots of Bowland to an extent through this idea of access land. But still, I think, growing up there and working with communities around there since, you'd argue that there's still a lag or a latency and perception of this place is not for me. And I think coupled with that, there's a real kind of sense of inside and outside. The communities I've been working in, and I know you've worked in a lot in the past, Carenza, around Pendle and Burnley and Nelson, are some of the most deprived areas in England. And just a few miles away, you have land owned by some of the richest people in England. So within a few miles, you have this kind of transect of inside and outside, often in these post-industrial towns, these former mill towns. You can see the hills, but you might not ever be able to get to them or go or feel that you can kind of journey to that land. And I think it can be a case of so near, so far. So really, I've been wanting to kind of circle these fringes of Bowland to think about how actually this landscape isn't an island. It's kind of constantly made through interactions and back and forth with the outside. And we can think about that in terms of flows of capital and trade and industry, not only over previous centuries, but for hundreds, thousands of years. And so what I wanted to do is kind of really dig deep into what were the lives of people living around the fringes of Bowland like, and what were their kind of perceptions of Bowland, what are the things that are holding them back from being able to access it more, and and there is a quiet politics there of saying, well, actually this landscape is absolutely for everybody. And it just turns out that art or creative practice has been a really amazing forum for doing that, for creating spaces, to loop back to Ruth, for listening and for making people feel safe and making people feel heard, to be able to amplify their voices and their perspectives that might otherwise be underheard or overlooked. And there's this lovely sense of, it's a global movement of environmental justice, of saying, well, actually, how can the overlooked, the underheard voices actually be given a platform or a sense of amplification to speak to these landscapes that have historically been, the narrative hold has been controlled by the privileged few.
And Ruth, I mean, I know that we're talking that very in a kind of social justice and almost political sphere, is what Rob's sort of alluding to within You Are Lost. I mean, Are You Lost? But Ruth, within your own work, how do you address those types of access to land? How do you bring that landscape into people's lives within your work?
Yeah, it's different, I think. I have a different sort of practice. I'm working primarily one-to-one in psychotherapy with adults, and then in other various sort of group or and online settings, which still, I hope, is always infused with the outdoor sense of place and bringing, into the kind of psychological domain, I suppose. But access, if you're asking about access, that's a difficult one. And again, it's very political. Psychotherapy is also an enclosure part by design, and it's, we are intentionally trying to create a safe space. But safe for who and what's on the outside and what's on the inside, but also the political aspect of, we have a huge mental health crisis. We don't have enough therapists, enough counselors, there isn't enough provision. So there are real tensions in access to therapy and access to a place-based therapy, just as there are in the landscape. So actually all of these themes, they start to intersect. There is something core, I think, at the heart of whether it's art or therapy or listening. It's, who is being listened to, who gets to be listened to, and how do we kind of break that down? And I think it's a real challenge in my work when I work in a sort of a very private one-to-one way, how to open that out. And some, that you have to be creative, and that's the value, I think, of creative practice. And that's why I spend a lot of time not just working in that quite intimate field of psychotherapy and one-to-one, but writing books, sharing practice, sharing thoughts around this, because there is a need to get these ideas into the public domain as well. You can't sit down with every single person and offer that sort of particular level of attention. So how else can this work that can be quite sited and very site specific be opened out to a broader audience, and to keep doing that and keep iterating that? So I'm not sure if that kind of answered your question, but I'm in touch with the tensions that are inherent in when we're talking about access. It's hard to, skirt around that issue as well.
And Rob, oh, have you? Oh, yeah. Well, I was just sorry, just wondering. So, what do you reflect on that? I mean, a lot of the things that Ruth has just mentioned, then sort of does I see within your work in terms of that sense of access and those personal interactions between the people that you work with and being in that space.
Yeah, I think it's very much bigger, broader debate at the moment, isn't it, about access to landscapes, across England, and I think access in has become a real key word throughout, the work that I've done with, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people, not just young people, but of all ages, all the way around the edge of Bowland, and it so often comes back to this idea of access. But what I've realized actually is, Bowland, in terms of its permissions, is now quite an accessible landscape. There's a huge, great chunk of it that is open access land that theoretically you can just go and have a wander or a run or do, essentially as long as you're responsible, do what you like. Um, but there's still this kind of almost more psychological barrier to access, which I do find really, really interesting. I think a latency from its kind of history as a private or exclusionary landscape. So that's been one kind of form of access that's really come out of all this work with people, is that access is psychological. Access is to do with confidence. Of course, it's also access is physical still. Bowland really suffers from the lack of public transport routes. It's a landscape that really you need a car to be able to, access big tracts of it, and it kind of is a landscape for the able-bodied to a large extent as well. Like there's incredible work done by the Forest of Bowland National Landscape to pioneer kind of accessible routes and altering wheelchairs and things, but in the most, it's one that you need kind of to be able-bodied to explore. So there's kind of, as well as being psychological, and um, it's also a kind of physical sense of access in Bowling. But then I think the third form of access that's really come out of all this kind of public work is one of imagination and hope. And I think access is also a form of being able to imagine a landscape, where it's been, what it's actually like, and perhaps most importantly for our ends, where it's going in the future. And I think that idea of being able to have this kind of imaginative dreaming of how a landscape might be more, how it might be more diverse, both culturally or in terms of biodiversity. If we're in this age that we're calling the Anthropocene, then pretty much guarantee that nature recovery has to go hand in hand with cultural recovery. And I think that's where, this form of imaginative access, which itself is a form of transparency and accountability for kind of letting other perspectives, other voices in to say, how is this landscape being managed? Who for? Why are we doing things that way? So I think those three forms of access, more so than that kind of, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of so many people, Tom Stevenson and all those sort of people who in Pendle have really kind of advocated for, legislative access, and the Countryside Rights Away Act in 2004 was such a huge step forward in that regard. And it's almost now, 20 odd years later, we're thinking about access in all these kind of nuanced, knotty forms, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah. I wonder if I can jump in there,
Please
'cause
do.
I'm kind of conscious that I've got hundreds of questions to ask, but there was something I really wanted to kind of stay with in that around you talk about open minds and open landscapes, and um, reflecting too on the Peak District as a national park, and the, as you say, the work, the shoulder of giants that this builds on. And it's not to be underestimated, is it? The psychological boundaries, the feeling of belonging that is intangible and very, you can't force it, you can't make it, you can't say, you belong, so you must feel like you belong. It can only be sort of fostered amongst people. And yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that, and I wanted to ask you about that because I've had the privilege of reading your field notes, of seeing your rough cut for the installation, of listening to the podcasts. You have spoken to hundreds of people. Your listening is incredibly generous, and it's really, I really wanted to have the space in this thing to say how moving I think the project was actually, and how moved I was as I was reading all of this rich input from so many people, and how you weren't you I don't know how you saw yourself going in, whether you saw yourself as an artist, but it's very clear from the work you've done that you're so much more than that, that you became this kind of listening, caring, sort of sensitive, responsible adult, who was very credible because you're also, you know, the area. And I don't know, I just wanted to sort of reflect back that I really saw that in the work, and I imagine that that will have done its own tacit, really important work around building a sense of belonging and encouraging that you in your personhood were and are a vital conduit to that work.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, that really means a lot. And yeah, I guess from my perspective, it's been like such a mega privilege to get to do this work because on one hand, it's been me kind of connecting deeper with a place that I know and love, but also, I've been everything has been enriched and challenged and pushed and made deeper by all these people. Some of the kids I've worked with and the young people have just been so fabulous and so clever and insightful and perceptive. And um I think in terms of going the role you take on going into a project like this is one of my young people in a school said early on, it's like, I thought we were working with an artist today, but all you do is ask weird questions. So yeah, maybe that is my new artistic practice, just asking weird questions. But it's certainly something I take from kind of paying attention to your work, Ruth, is that actually it's about creating listening spaces. It's about creating proving grounds, whether they're temporary or whether they're kind of long term over a series of workshops or tutorials or whatever you're doing with people. It's about making sure that people feel listened to and that they have the kind of confidence and that you can kind of transfer whatever form of skill, whether that's through sound recording or mark making or film recording or writing or anything that we're doing here. It's not an extractive thing of, that traditional model of researcher or artist turning up somewhere and extracting something for their work. It's perhaps more of a channeling, and it's trying to find creative strategies and creative spaces for that channeling. Where as the artist, you're just the middle person, you're just the mediator, you're just like helping another form of landscape expression, percolate up. So I do like to say it's not really about me. It's about everybody.
You
Everybody.
are, yeah, you're a receiver and picking up signals, and but that there was something, I suppose the what you've created there is incredible, and it's rich and it's very robust, and you did so many interventions and so many creative activities, and the gorgeous design and the sensitivity of listening. And then I was also struck about the absolute precarity, the precarity of access, the very sort of the precarious nature that here are the people that can see Pendle Hill outside their window, but it's like another world away. The fact that, you know, eh, yeah, the political situation, the different competing land uses, and then you've spent all this time fostering this kind of nascent belonging. And I wondered how you reflect on the possibilities of legacy, because, and this intersects with some of my questions, I suppose, around mental health and mental health support, is that we spend a lot of time saying, if you need to talk, reach out. If you need help, reach out. Go to your GP, go to so and so. And then there's not always the longevity of support behind it. And so, what are we sending people into? What's our ethical responsibility? And I was really curious about this project, that when you're really, inviting people to have their voices heard, that starts something. When someone's heard, it's contagious and you want to keep being listened to. And so, how's that going to maybe you don't know the answer, but how is that going to be continued in terms of legacies? So these young people, but also farmers, other people that don't feel listened to, how are they going to continue to feel heard so that this isn't just we drop in and then we leave? We've made the art, now we go. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I mean, again, it sort of relates to that. I guess maybe it's another commonality between what we do. It relates to that sense that an artist often gets, a set contract to go and do something, and it all relates to money at the end of the day, doesn't it? And what a kind of commissioning body or a client, I suppose, in your case, can afford to pay and over what period of time. And in this project, it's been a real privilege, and I think it's been hugely fertile that I have been able to work with communities kind of over a much longer, kind of very focused and very deep um, uh, period of time. And I should say again, in terms of that, standing on the shoulders of other projects, mine is an incredibly modest and incremental moment on the back of incredible work in the cultural ecosystem of East Lancs by organisations like In Situ and Super Slowway and the Pendle Hill Landscape Partnership rather, that this is not coming out of nowhere, and so it's building on a whole kind of fertile set of people trying to think differently and trying to build capacity and think about the future in new ways. Um, in terms of the legacy of my specific project, one thing that I've done a lot is tried to build this kind of skilling through with, especially with my young people. So to give you an example, I worked a lot with Yes Hub, an organisation in the town of Nelson, which works with young people who are out of work or training. One of the most inspirational groups of people I've ever worked with, just fabulous. And we worked over the winter. I ran a podcast making course, and it was kind of from the fundamentals of, storytelling and narrative writing through to the practicalities of recording and editing and things like that. And they took it upon themselves to design a podcast called Pendle's Hidden Histories, and or Pendle's Hidden Gems rather, and they each researched a history of Bowland and Pendle, and they sort of varied from bog burials up on the top of the fell near Clough Pike through to kind of feminist rereadings of the Pendle witch trials, and they each kind of recorded and narrated them, and then had these discussions about how they relate actually to their daily lives and experiences of kind of inequality or exclusion, or and it was, I'd encourage, if people do one thing after seeing this talk today, is to go and find that specific podcast, because those youngsters are just incredible. But what it meant is that, as well as teasing out this kind of archive of voices and perspectives towards my work, it also meant that they now all have like a very definite kind of skill that can go on CVs, it can be talked about, it can be used in, as a form of kind of documentation of the places that they live and the experiences that they have. So just kind of trying to build those public engagements throughout the whole winter and spring that have all these kind of different purposes that try and build a foundation of after I'm gone. And physically, hopefully the idea is I'll keep working in these areas just on different projects. But whilst I'm here, I'm trying to build a longevity.
Yeah, I love that. But there's something really important, isn't there, about you? None of us in any of our work can tackle everything everywhere all at once. Some of these things like climate and land access and everything, these are almost hyper objects which are too hard to get our arms around. And so I love you know how I'm a fan of pragmatism, the deep pragmatism of um, skilling, which is, it's no small thing, is it? Just the skill building of for people coming in, they are in one way kind of small, deeply pragmatic steps, but in another way, this is how it works. This is how everything moves forward. That kind of one person at a time feeling, oh, I've got a knack for this, and I wholly agree. Those podcasts are sublime.
Thank you. Again, all about the youngsters, not about me. But I think it's a wider sense of, saying this place matters, this place I matter, and this place matters, and it's worth a kind of fine-grained, detailed sense of observation and description, and creativity wells up from here, and creativity helps us tell stories about our daily lives, but it also gives us a kind of a voice in decision making. And I've tried to kind of foster a sense of that, with this back and forth between, the fringe and Bowland itself. This landscape isn't some faraway place.
Yeah, and that word creativity keeps coming back, doesn't it? And that has a lot of resonance in my work, I think, as creativity as expression, which everyone has a right to, and everyone has the skills for within themselves. It feels that there is, when I've been reading your notes, it's not about an art installation, although it has that aspect, and you bring that. It's actually about facilitating the inherent creativity in everyone, and I love that idea that the wellspring of that, that it's here, it's there, it's in everyone, and giving. Sometimes I think in the arts in particular, it's incumbent upon those who are on the inside to say that this is for everyone, because it's like another thing that can feel ring fenced and that there's no access for. Um and as you get older, like I am now, that you sort of think, well, I'm not going to wait around for permission. But I've got the ability to do that for myself, but to be able to offer that for young people or people who feel really on the outside and say, no, it's not about making art. It's about tapping into your own idiosyncratic way of seeing the world and feeling the world, and that is so needed. That is so has a place in the landscape in everyone's lives. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's that kind of, it's not holding creativity up as a kind of, a thing that only the skilled or the trained or the educated
Mm,
artists can do, but it's actually creativity is the kind of the ongoing set of acts that all of us do that build a landscape and build a life, right? And
mm,
it's like it could be, filmmaking or sound recording, or in your case, kind of like moving with rocks, or or whatever it is. But it could also be dry stone walling, or it could be, the way you build a fence, like the way you shear a sheep, like all these things. It sounds ridiculous in a way, but it's so true. There is a care and a
mm,
skill um, and I think sometimes that can be a common ground. It's every landscape is constantly coming into being through the acts that we do,
mm,
rather than being preserved in aspic, and I
mm.
think that's certainly, again, a kind of quiet radicalism in a place like Bowland that has this very set kind of historical narrative of what it is and who it's for. And I
Yeah.
think, you must see it, and I'd love to hear you talk about it in your work where you take clients outside kind of to do the therapeutic work, because I see it in every, session I do where I take groups out from the town into the hills, and we do, sometimes we do focused sessions, and sometimes we just play, and mess about in the river, and build things in the forest. And there is a sense of unfurling, perhaps, that you see in people. Um, I think, that slow, patient kind of observation of that is really fascinating. I don't know how you reflect on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's I often think that left to our own devices, probably as adults, we probably default to sensible and the interjects that we take on about how to be over in our lives. So there is something that I'm coming back to in my practices at the moment, be it therapeutic and art based, or whatever you want to call them, creative practices, about coming back to playfulness. And going back to that idea of just expression and unfolding and unfurling. And I think when you trust in that as an inevitability if you create the right conditions, then great and exciting things happen. And I think that's where I'm at the moment, is really feeling the value of, if you just create the space, if you just invest in creative space holding and places for people just to be, and you create, and that creating that environment is no small thing, I would also say. It takes that is built over time. It's another thing you can't force. You don't just say, here's a space, like, now be free and playful. But if you work to create that, and that ambience, and that ethic in your work, then so much comes out of that. And I've seen that actually in my therapeutic work, in other work, it's the most transformative. It's that kind of creative play, whether it's being done by young people. I don't work with young people, but whether it's with adults as well, there is something very vitalizing that sort of springs up, and there's space sort of for all of it. Yeah.
It's an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because on the surface of all of this chat that we're having can seem quite surface level about, play or, experience or unfurling. But actually, I think what it is, it has an incredible depth to it. And it has a
Mm.
real kind of emotional and political kind of potential to it that I really enjoy kind of shuttling between. I mean, anybody who's worked with people in the past will know that, it's quite often you shuttle between those two poles of the very daft and like the incredibly profound.
Mm.
I wondered if maybe is that your experience? Like, what kind of, we're talking in a Zoom call hosted by the National Landscapes, who are thinking about kind of governmental policy and what the arts can do to kind of flesh this stuff out. What do you think we can do, as creative practitioners, to kind of stay with the trouble, to use Donna Haraway's term, to stay with the thickness and the messiness of everyday life, but also to kind of say, actually, this stuff matters within kind of decision-making realms?
Oh, good question. Um,
Yeah, I should have briefed you on that one first, hey?
we haven't done any briefing on this. Why change a habit of a lifetime? This is how we work best. Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, I just keep coming back to listening and mattering. I thought that was a really good word, that everything can matter and everything does matter and everything is fruitful and rich in that way. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's probably above my cognitive level to think how that gets communicated to policymakers and funders. But I think you're really right. There is the profound next to the very sort of silly and absurd, and that's life. And all of this can be very serious, but all of it needs to also be playful. But also, just logistics hold up the ability to be profound and playful. So, when I was thinking about your project, I was thinking about the devastation of there being no buses and it taking 2 hours. Like, if you have barriers to playfulness and barriers to profundity that is just a bus stop, just a bus ride away, again, the deeply pragmatic thing of just needing some of those basic bits to be in place. Then you hold the space, then you get people in, and then you listen, and you listen like it all matters. You have to listen like it all matters, and without agenda. And I think that's something that the therapeutic sphere or therapists try and move towards, that how, and that's very hard when you're doing funding programs and policies, because it's rich in agenda, and there is always that sort of third arm that can be present in therapy. But that's one thing I love about the therapeutic space, is you just open the space and be confident to hold what emerges. And I would love to see more funding put to that, more trust in people and creative people to say, actually, what is going to emerge is going to be what matters, and not to sort of over engineer that from the off, but to sort of trust your creatives, trust your locals, trust relationships to deliver what they need when you bring people together. Yeah, I didn't think I was going to end up with that answer, but I really, as I say it, I really feel it's true. I really feel like trusting relationships is one thing that is often not present in a lot of the ways that we can exist with between the individual and society. And actually, I think it's, yeah, I'm there at my answer.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that to keep using our spectrum, that's very profound. And trust is another key word that's really come out of all this public stuff that I've done throughout Are You Lost, and thinking about it on all and every side, there's, I think, perhaps mistrust kind of runs quite deep throughout a lot of the kind of interpersonal and inter-institutional relationships across Bowland. There's ideas of not being listened to or being maligned or being, marginalized that are not only people on the fringes, but people right in the middle of Bowland, farmers feeling like
Yeah.
their kind of senses of their lives are being defined by decision makers from elsewhere. And one of the things, again, it was documented in a podcast that I absolutely loved in this project was um, taking a group of young people out to a farm on the edge of Pendle Hill, close to Nelson, run by this incredible farmer, Philip Marginson, and his wife. And it was a group of maybe half the young people were of Southeast Asian descent, and the conversation that they had in the farmyard just blossomed into this whole thing about, well, why don't more Asian communities get into
Mm.
farming? Relationship between livestock production and kind of, religious festivals and traditions, and this kind of real back and forth. And then Philip kind of talking about, the realities and the kind of precarity of modern day farming. And again, it's like you said before, it's almost like you set the starting points for these situations and you sort of almost stand back and let the thing unfurl, because these are the sort of conversations that perhaps don't happen enough.
I felt like I was hearing something so radical in that podcast. And as I listened to it, I thought, I wonder how where this is going to go. And again, there was me expressing a bit of sort of not mistrust, but like worry about what's going to come. And I was just absolutely rapt listening to that episode. I just thought that was such an incredible conversation between them and living sort of different worlds and different experiences. Sorry, I jumped in there, but it felt like that was really, yeah, it was a great exemplar of.
No, I'll always take interrupting praise. But I think I heard recently, because yeah, this idea of trust has really come out, and talking a lot with farmers, and trust is very, very slow to get, in terms of that back and forth between different people kind of making decisions about managing the land. And I heard this phrase, and you probably know it as well, but it said that change happens at the pace of trust. And I was like, who said that? I'll find out. That must be some deep philosopher. I'm going to use that in the work. Turns out it was the author of How to Make Friends and Influence People. So I'm still like on a level as to whether it's got profundity, but I'm going to
Yeah,
say it was
sacred and
some,
profane.
Greek philosopher. But I think it really relates to here, and it relates to time, and it relates
Yeah.
to generational inheritance and change. Change happens at the pace of trust. It really does.
I'm really sorry to interrupt myself because obviously just a little bit conscious of time and we do have a few questions there, but I just wanted to say I hate to interrupt actually. We're sort of in a really lovely kind of sweet spot, I think, in terms of what you are both discussing around your practice. I'm loving this discussion around trust because I think it is something that we all work so hard to build on when we're sort of bringing sort of abstract things like art, or to communities or to young people, or whatever that might be. And I also really love seeing how this overlap around the therapeutic realm and what creativity can also bring to that, and actually the amount of therapeutic part in the well-being, I suppose that's the buzzword, really, around engaging the arts, but also in the landscape as well. It's something that we're seeing across all our projects, that without having to be very explicit, it's so implicit within the way that we're working with communities in landscape and teasing out the projects. You mentioned the podcast. We will be able to send links to all the audience afterwards about some of the things that you've been referring to. And if there are some publications that you might mention or names in there that you might want to just send links out, we are able to send that out to you. But certainly you can access links to Rob's brilliant podcast, which Lancaster Arts, which are the producers working with Rob, have hosted. You can get that on our website as well, so via Rob's pages on our website. So I'm just going to scroll back. There was a couple of questions from Marianne in the audience. She says, if you're going to ask this to Rob, I believe, if you're going to ask yourself one weird question about the Forest of Bowland, what would it be, and what would the answer be? If you refer back to your new practice of asking weird questions.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think as I've kind of said, one of the absolute joys of this project, because I kind of grew up beside Pendle Hill and lived in Bowland for years, and I'm a big fell runner, so I spend a lot of time like out falling in bogs and out of phone reception for hours on end, which my partner always really loves. But this project has itself prompted so many weird and unusual questions. And I think to go back again to that Yes Hub podcast of hidden histories of the hills, I don't know if there's a specific question in there, but just the way that young people saw histories of Bowland that people who might have lived there for generations and generations might not know about, I think absolutely blew my mind. And then to relate them back to their lived experiences of the town, I think that's been one of the most kind of profound things of making deep, obscured histories of Bowland, even if you can't get there physically, kind of talk to contemporary life now. Maybe it's not quite a weird question, but it's got a depth. So yeah, that's one of the things that's been a real revelation for me.
You often ask yourself weird questions, Ruth.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I consider myself a weird question. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And yeah, I think probably that's the therapist's way, is thinking about one's own weirdnesses and how that belongs, and going back to that sort of space that there's room for everyone, and getting people towards feeling safe in themselves and their weirdnesses and their idiosyncrasies, and the sort of the weirdness in nature, the queerness of nature. So I think that's my interest, is how do we bring our weird selves into a weird world.
And that's the playfulness as well, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
That really can really strike on. There's a question here, another one. When working the landscape and or with landowners, have you encountered any surprising opportunities or difficulties regarding perceived or real boundaries from a nature and cultural recovery perspective? I think that's probably more to Rob.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it speaks to this kind of emerging, we could call it hybrid role that an artist working in these, let's call them partnership working, situations has to kind of navigate. And, I've done a lot of this in the past, but it's been, almost supercharged in Bowland. There are so many cooks in this broth. And as an artist, you're in the middle of this kind of meshwork of, you know, of landowning, land management, policy, arts and cultural kind of organizations, all of whom perhaps have a different gloss on what an artist is and what an artist does, you know, and so I feel that you really have to kind of shape shift. You know, you wear a lot of hats as kind of mediator, connector, therapist, you know, disruptor, to use all these horrible Silicon Valley terms, but you really, and but then also, you know, insider, somebody with a sort of Lancashire accent who knows the fells, you know, you sort of duck and weave a little bit to, um, I think that idea, and again, it comes back to that idea of what an artist does, you know, and for me, it's asking unusual questions is often the starting point, and I've used that as a way in to kind of connect with all sorts of different people across the landscape. There have, I mean, I don't really want to get into it, but there have been like quite a few attempts to sort of engage with the big landowning um, institutions, let's say in Bowland, that haven't been particularly forthcoming. So that's been a real kind of barrier to me as artists that I would have liked to have been able to have more critical engagement with. But then there's also a politics and a diplomacy that everyone is kind of managing this landscape on a knife edge, you know, trying to work towards nature recovery, cultural recovery, and there's a lot of vested interests and it's not easy, and so you sort of as artists have to realize your positionality and your porosity in that situation, and you know, kind of push as far as you're going to push, but do you want to upset the apple cart of the wider thing? You know, there's, I think this is absolutely fascinating. If there were artists or researchers wanting to think about this new hybrid form of the artist that is demanded by these partnership working situations, there's a hell of a lot of critical work to be done on it.
Mm.
Oh, thanks very much. So there's another one here from Deb. How do you respond to anyone in the community who might not trust the importance of art when perhaps they think money would be better spent on more practical things in the area?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, I mean, you must have seen this a lot, you know, working in kind of Nelson and Burnley of, you know, wouldn't this be better? Wouldn't this money be better spent on something practical, you know, a playground or something? But I guess all I can come back to is to loop back to the start really, and to Ruth and I's common ground that in terms of my practice, it's that idea of listening and spaces to kind of document and amplify and connect and pass on perspectives, you know. And so I think I'd hope the money spent is absolutely, you know, value for money. I don't know if you've got a perspective on that as well, Ruth.
I think art is often, yeah, I mean, art is such a nebulous, for a very short word, very nebulous, saying nothing at all sort of term. And I think, you know, what do we mean by it? There's clearly a huge difference between something hanging up in this kind of gallery age, you know, that we live in, and the kind of something that you can hang on a wall. And what we're talking about, and perhaps art in its use in psychotherapy, long and lovely history of art as just a way of reaching people, and as you say, listening and communicating. And I think, you know, it's very hard to sort of to dig out people's immediate perceptions, but art as a vehicle for just connecting people with humanity, their humanity, each other's. It's a way in, and it can be a very generative way in, and just as important as, you know, yeah, satisfying the practicality. So the idea that it's separate from practicality, we just don't have a good language, and we need a new language that kind of brings into parity of esteem the kind of the role of what we put in inverted commas as art, and really what we're talking about, yeah, is kind of listening and mattering practices that are also creative expressions. You know, we somehow need a new vernacular for it.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with me and how you actually even bring that language to the table to get something off the ground. And you know, and you're right, if for some reason with music we're able to sort of understand the genres and types of music can be, you know, can exist in different spaces with different people in different ways. But I think often with art, or particularly visual art, or this particular approach that, you know, Rob works with, then, you know, it's harder to define, you know, and people sort of get very rigid boundaries around it. Anyway, before we wrap up, I think we have Juliet said, my question is about balancing the need for documentation and avoiding interruptions with personal connection and enhancement of experience and landscape. I wonder whether that might need to be, if we can take something from that. Avoiding...
Less documentation, I'm going to throw it in there.
So not documentation, but actually creating personal connections. What do you think?
We probably both have thoughts. Rob, you go.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess, again, to bring it back to archaeologists, I've been doing this thing where every kind of public event, and there's been so many of them, we've had maps up with kind of sticky labels of Bowland that have kind of invited people to map places, sites within Bowland that are somehow memorable or important or charged for them. And again, we've had hundreds of these locations, and so again, to run that kind of gamut between the daft and the profound, we've had, you know, things like here's where I found out what I wanted. Here's where, you know, I came out to my mum and found out about a sister I never had. Here's where they buried the placenta of my baby, you know, up on some more. And they kind of run all the way to, you know, slay and say scares me and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, but what it's done is it's kind of given me all the filming sites for the Are You Lost installations that are going to be on this summer. So I've gone to as many of these, about 90 of them, locations through Bowland with this kind of little moment or little kind of almost like a kind of geopoetic, yeah, like moment in time and place. And filmed there for the installation. And I've been filming through these lenses made with natural materials like feathers and leaves and seed pods made by some of my young people in Selfa in Bentham. So I suppose maybe that's riffing on that theme of having this very specific personal experience that's been, you know, offered by the public, which has then been kind of made abstract and full of possibility in the work.
Thanks, Rob. And just as we wrap up, because it is coming up to 1, I just wanted to first of all say thank you ever so much to Ruth and Rob for being our first nature calling and conversation event. We have a message here from Paul Shorrock about how to get involved, and he also says an offer of some fishing is still there for you, Rob. But maybe, Rob, if you just wanted to quickly run through where we can see your project coming up over the summer.
Yeah, so there's going to be 3 installation locations. They're going to be film, sound, and kind of large textiles made with the artist Cato Farrell. They're going to be on show at Pendle Festival of Culture on the 28th of June. They'll be at Ginny's Barn in Dunsop Bridge between the 1st and the 3rd of August. And then they'll be at Gisborne Forest Hub on the 30th and 31st of August. So 3 locations from the middle of the town to the middle of Bowland. And at each installation location, there'll be tons of kind of workshops and activities that people can come and get involved in.
Yes, so please do come along if you're local. Otherwise, keep an eye on our website. We'll be updating across all the 6 projects across the country. On the website, like I said before, you can access the podcasts that Rob's been talking about. And we've got a few messages, I think, in the chat there, which is about our next session, which will be on the 25th of June with the artists David Blandy and Daniel Locke, who are the commissioned artists for the Surrey Hills National Landscape. So I'm going to end it there. If there are any questions that I might have missed, then I think we can gather them up and we can maybe get some responses from Ruth and Rob, and we can pass it on as part of the onward resource list that we can send. And thank you ever so much for attending, and thanks again to Ruth and Rob.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
See ya.